Again, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Claudia Cotca from Washington, D.C. and founder and CEO of Global Leadership Dentistry and Sciences. And I welcome you to the springboard of the 2022 Symposiums series. I'd like to invite Krista Sherban, DDS candidate from University of Dentistry and Pharmacology in Timisoara, and with some remarks and with the subsequent engagement into the scope and reason why we are meeting today.
Welcome, everyone. So I will start off by giving out a quick introduction. So Professor Claudia C. Cotca DDS MPH, a 3 times graduate of University of Michigan, Bachelor of Science Chemistry degree in Cellular Molecular Biology, MPH Toxicology and Environmental Health Sciences, and Doctor of Dental Surgery, is an internationally recognized lecturer, USA delegate expert with American Dental Association Standards Committee, Dental Products ADA, Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, American National Standards Institute, International Standardization Organization, International Electrotechnical Commission, and Association of Federal and Drug Officials in Aesthetic and Systemic Dentistry, Therapeutics, Biodigitization, Toxicology. Dr. Claudia C. Cotca is a founder and CEO of various ventures, including Washington Institute for Dentistry and Laser Surgery. Dr. Claudia C. Cotca practices and consults globally in private and public health, with track records in innovation of clinical protocols, medical devices, global laser technology, clinical applications, and healthcare commodity technology transfer. Dr. Claudia C. Cotca holds various fellowships in USA and international honorary societies, is program chair of IADR and AADOCR Pharmacology, Therapeutics, Toxicology and Group, and is editor of various scientific subject journal matters. Dr. Claudia is a healthcare analyst in USA Model and global health sector intelligence, healthcare policy, and expert in witness before USA Congress and White House. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Krista, for that introduction. Krista is obviously the global ambassador for GLDS. It's really my honor and privilege to have her lead the ambassadorial team, and you've already had opportunities to engage with her, and I know that without a doubt you see the formidability of her leadership expertise and the availability that she is supporting the scope and mission of GLDS globally. We are going to first launch the series of the symposium with the topic of 360 healthcare, and that being some housekeeping items prior to jumping in and describing what it is, of course, and subsequent details, which I think are necessary to address as healthcare experts, as well as interact with the communities at large. I'd like to just kindly remind you that we can be reached, of course, on the www at the website, as well as LinkedIn. And the intent here is to ensure that we make accessible the through the symposium, the scope and mission of GLDS, and that is to hone leadership skills for healthcare experts. Specifically, we are speaking about dentistry here and the dental experts. And I like to just disclose a few items. I am the founder, as noted by Krista earlier, of Washington Institute for Dentistry and Laser Surgery, C3 think tank, 360 Healthcare, as well as Global Leadership Dentistry and Sciences and other ventures. All the photography, of course, and everything that conceptualized has been developed here on the premises of the Institute, as well as C3 think tank. And I engage with various different industries in collaborations or input, and of course I am focused on developing the clinical protocols. And so that needed to be identified prior to starting our discussion. And so the objectives today is essentially for you to have a micro and macro vision of what is 360 healthcare. And our focus will incorporate, first of all, to identify what is 360 healthcare as a healthcare commodity vis-a-vis a Hippocratic Oath axis. What are the participants of the sector requirements, the leadership requirements, and of course, past, present, and future steps and recommendations and visuals. 360 healthcare incorporates a micro and macro view of extension, not just of the actual subject matter component with respect to interdisciplinary, for instance, sciences. Vis-a-vis our scope, of course, being in head and neck and dentistry, we understand that there are certain specialties that comprise that differentiation, but we also incorporate the extension to the application of the systemic body. And so there's a clinical interdisciplinary coordination that occurs. And we, for instance, do happen to specialize in that particular volumetric space that is extremely heterogeneous, extremely dense and irregular in the geoposition of the physiological process. And so it's not just the clinical component, that there's a trigonometry of disciplines that have to be incorporated and have to be noted for, so that we can have and identify clinical outcomes with precision and optimization, irrespective of the hurdles. But also the healthcare commodity space extends with other participants that actually affect that particular function and responsibility as an expert. Now, without a doubt, we definitely have the assumption, there are going to be some assumptions here, some core pillars. The clinical experts and the academic experts on subject matter are the experts of the commodity space. But what is the extension of the 360 healthcare with respect to protecting the subject matter, protecting the development and engagement of the subject matter with the community at large? Starts in the clinical setting, as well as extensive within the communities, as well as jurisdictional, geoposition, etc. And so that said, we are going to just list and go into a small, I would say, detail just because of the interest in time. However, subsequently, there will be presentations within the symposium series that will go into specific detail within each subsector, if you will, or subsection that comprises the activity of the healthcare commodity as well as functionality. And I'm going to start, these are no particular order, with the private public experts. So clinicians and academicians and subject matter experts, both from the sciences as well as from the clinical sciences within dentistry or medical, for instance, sciences, are the experts. Now, I'm going to make some references here which are probably going to be more accurate given the jurisdictional settings. And when we talk about, for instance, even though our interest, of course, is globally, and we want to exchange and we want to share globally, but jurisdictionally, there are parameters that will make that or facilitate that implementation of subject matter, that access to subject matter and interaction with the public by the expert with the subject matter differentiated. And so I'm going to, of course, assume here that we're speaking about the USA model, but of course, customization and nuance of extension will be appropriately inferred as well as recommended. And so the academic component ranges within the curriculum, of course, set up the standardization component based on that development and the resources. The R&D, research and development sector, comes from the facilitation of interest in innovation, facilitation of interest in making accessible the prototyping, if you will. Clinical protocols as well fit into this realm, as well as within the of course, the individualized or group settings of private-public experts. From a actual subsector component, if I can call it that way, is the industry coming in with actually facilitating those technological representations or illustrations as medical devices, for instance, or other types of platforms that either transfer subject matter, inform on subject matter, or actually facilitate that engagement in subject matter. From a regulatory perspective, in the United States, we have ANSI and NIST. In other, obviously, each country has its regulatory reflection or setup and matrix of accessibility. From a national perspective or international perspective, I should say, is basically ISO, IEC, ITU, and other regulatory bodies that actually complement each other and incorporate subject matter specificity. For instance, technologically speaking, subject matter is more regulated through the IEC in terms of digital computer science platforms, as opposed to the actual specificity of the expert subject matter with respect to dentistry, which is more through the ISO at the international level. And so those bodies and those particular parallels will intersect and will collaborate to enhance and contribute through the larger platform. With respect to the parameters of geoposition, legislation, and government is incredibly meaningful in identifying, first of all, leadership in the United States. For instance, experts, subject matter experts like dentists and physicians, as well as mental health, are considered first-tier leaders, meaning that they are the leadership that designate and have control, autonomy over their profession. That means by legislation, they are given the jurisdiction to execute and to recommend as best as at will based on their knowledge, and they're given full jurisdiction to do that. The business component, for instance, of the subsector interaction on the healthcare commodity space incorporates venture capital, the business operational side, the corporate side, of course, small, mid-size, and large, either through an open market or through a modified market, either through the private market or the public market. And what I like to say is that here's where is an example where the private health component, by extension to the private, to the public health component, becomes almost a continuous flow of extension. And this is where it merits, of course, subsequent requirements for the breakdown of each sector through future presentations. The last three, not least, of course, we are having the consumers segment, if you will, or subsector. We know that consumers have a rendition of exposure by information that does not necessarily come through the experts, but comes through other portals. There are consumer platforms that now, with digitization, have grown much more extensive, much more readily available, and of course much more impactful. From the media component, there is a aspect of interaction and of course dissemination of information and updates, and of course of impact that needs to be recognized as a subsector component that interacts with the healthcare commodity. And of course, last but not least, the legal aspect, and this is where we're talking about tracing and how do we promote innovation, the strategic component, thought, logic in mind in terms of tracing that innovation, in terms of timing, position to market, launching of protocols to the market, and not just protocols, but other aspects of impacting through legal means the healthcare commodity space, either by definition, interaction, of course, accessibility, etc. That said, my premise has always been that that healthcare commodity is a unique commodity as opposed to any other commodity. And the realities of what we are dealing with here includes the aspects of what has already been briefly referenced with respect to the level of requirements that we as experts, as scientists, as clinicians, either in the private sector or the public health sector, requirement to practice and by credentials and by license to contribute and to exchange of that commodity, of that particular rendition of subject matter with the consumer, and the consumer being, of course, patient. But by extension, as I mentioned earlier, the opportunity is always that a individualized and customized protocol in the private setting will inevitably render impact in the public extension. And as an expert in both private setting clinician space as well as public health, both by credentialing and practice, I have to say that there is that axis of continuity which has not always been recognized nor implemented when developing either action-driven potential or standardizations or regulatory or even innovative constructs, if you will, at the very incipient or starting level of implementation. Now, I'm going to just specifically, I would say, wrap up the presentation by highlighting that all these participants and all these subsectors really have an important contribution, opportunity, and privilege to transact in the sector. However, because of the requirement to the subject matter by the subject matter is to the Hippocratic Oath component, it goes by derivation and logical adaptation that the participants ought to transact according to the code of conduct to the Hippocratic Oath. And so in some of the subsectors or subsections, if you will, of healthcare commodity space, either in the clinical protocol settings or the clinical devices settings, do transact and actually do incorporate that approach. It is not done across the board. And we know, for instance, there's significant pressures as we speak at the national by jurisdiction boundary level as well as the global component in terms of how medical devices are accessible, how medical devices are rendered in terms of transitioned, and of course incorporated through either individualistic satellite locale incorporation or by mass distribution. And that of course incorporates what I've mentioned here beforehand, some of the other participants, including media, legislation, regulatory, etc. Now, going back to pulling it all together, how is this relevant to the GLDS members, constituents, and particularly US leaders? It is absolutely important that irrespective of what your micro focus or the micro focus is of an expert, the macro vision is first recognized, incorporated in the logic. The data rendered through any type of formulation or algorithm is as good in quantity or quality as the logic by which it is generated. And that strategic recognition and conceptualization ought to occur at the very baseline level of recognition. And so what we want to do here on this particular, through this particular platform, is first of all enhance leadership skills with respect to understanding the nuance of the extensions of where the healthcare commodity actually occurs in terms of the transaction point, not just, for instance, within a specific clinical setting, but the actual variables and the axis by which that particular clinical setting is actually developed. The past and the present has been, as we know it, an interesting combination of data, generation, and innovations, many of which really, for example, sit on shelves and never get implemented. And yet we have certain contributions or certain innovations that actually make it in mass distribution. And the question that every leader ought to ask, among others, is why is that? First of all and foremost, we are clinicians, and we so adhere to the Hippocratic Oath. We adhere to the do no harm to the best that we can according to the knowledge that we have at the time of treatment, even though it hasn't necessarily been proven in mass distribution. And so with that premise, that compilation and standard of adaptation needs to be incorporated into the rendition of the healthcare commodity space, and the participants that incorporate transactions or want to have an interested contribution need to recognize that A, the health sector is led by the clinical and sciences experts, and B, to transact in that space, there is an oath which does not exist in other sectors of transaction or commodity spaces. And with that, I'd like to just again review to identify where we have sort of tracked in terms of the objectives and where we will be going in the future. I hope this has been I would say, baseline, broad insight into the rendition of, first of all, understanding of 360 healthcare extension, not just in the subject matter expertise, but also in the combination or the extension of transacting of the healthcare commodity space, either through clinical protocols or medical devices. That includes information. To understand the participants are very real and they're actually active, and they will be active. To understand the sector requirements is actually in function of the participants within the respective axis of interest. And of course, by rendition, I'd be able to identify within for yourselves what are the requirements of leadership required for that particular function, meaning a leader in a public health sense in sciences or oral sciences will have, of course, the same type of leadership requirements that one would have in the clinical sense, although the customization component may be different, but the macro view and the macro understanding of the participants that contribute needs to be there for optimal, of course, assessment, as well as optimal activity and goal achievement. And with that, of course, we hope that GLDS is going to give that platform for the individuals who wish to engage in leadership opportunities, leadership execution, and through the project development, of course, opportunities to bring projects or actually customize projects for the actual practice in real time is of important notice here. That said, I'd like to thank you so much for your attention. It's been my privilege to give you this brief introduction. And for the next few minutes, I'd like to entertain some questions and remarks, although it'll be short. However, if there is an extension of those questions, I'd be happy to follow up with another session.